dementia researcher with a blog and a rating.
The cost of research, or why it's way harder than it used to be. Today, we're going to talk about my midlife crisis and why there's nothing that can be done about it. For those of you who have yet to realise it, I'm a big fan of the Freakonomics network of podcasts. I know absolutely nothing about economics, but enjoy learning about everything from the potential of donut economies to the cost of public transport. And it's relevant today because I am going to try and be an economist. Or at least I'm going to try and talk to you about money and the state of science funding in the UK. It's going to be long and possibly boring. As always, this was precipitated by a chat with someone. All my pieces are. Apparently, I don't do any actual work. I just natter with friends and colleagues about stuff. But this one was me telling a mentor that I felt like a bit of a failure. One of the reasons I felt that way was because at my age, she had a lab of about 8 people with several grants and students. I remember enjoying pictures of my other PhD supervisor's office at my age because the lab had decided, as a prank for his birthday, to wrap every single object in his office in tinfoil. I don't have an office. I don't even have a permanent job. Up until about 2 months ago, I was due to be unemployed in a couple of weeks' time. But I've done nothing different to them, so why would they a success where I've been a failure? This is where the mentor jumped in and said, no, you've not been a failure. It's much harder now than it was then. She highlighted that she'd had people champion her at the right times, highlighted again that she'd been incredibly lucky, but also just said that it's generally harder than it was. I mentioned it to a friend who's a couple of years ahead of me, and she said that of course it was harder now. Everything is about 3 times more expensive, and there were loads more people than there used to be competing for money that doesn't go nearly as far. I wanted to check that blasé statement, and that's where the economics comes in. We're going to attempt to deep dive into scientific finances and how far they stretch. For the sake of everyone's sanity, I have picked 3 years to focus on: 2000, 2010, and 2020. We're going to look at how much stuff costs and costed, how many scientists there were and are, how much people got paid throughout those times, how much they asked for, and what they did with the money. Let's start with some basic numbers. According to a variety of random reports that I trawled through from various higher ed institutions, there is a general upward trend in the number of people doing PhDs in the UK across the time periods I've selected. In 2000, there were approximately 13,000 graduating with a PhD. In 2010, it was closer to around 38,000, and in 2020, it was close to 44,000. The lag in the last few years seems to be entirely because of a combination of the pandemic and Brexit. Countries like Germany and Canada are attracting more students than us now because they're just as easy to get to, the courses are just as good, and often the lifestyle and funding are better. But irrespective, we've still got to try and fund 3 times as many PhD students as we did 20 years ago. And what do these students cost to run? Way back in 2000, or so I am told by colleagues who were postdocing around then, you could easily run a PhD student off odds and ends of existing grants, simply because science was not as expensive as it is now, and because everyone wasn't trying to single-cell sequence everything. In 2010, you could get a grant to get a PhD student. In fact, I applied for a grant to become a PhD student around that time, and found that there was quite a wide array of places I could have written to for funding. Now PhD students are allocated by local doctoral training centres. The doctoral training programme for Oxford, run by the BBSRC, for example, has around 40 students. The MRC one has around 22. At this point, your job is now not to advertise a role and recruit, but to advertise yourself and your lab and your research and hope someone likes you enough to want to join your lab. I can hear you saying, aren't they the same though? And on paper, yes, they appear to be the same. But when you're in a large institution, if you're not visible and making noise about your research, then nobody knows about you, especially not busy doctoral students. But if you teach them, then suddenly you are on their radar and you become much more popular as a destination lab. Which means, as with so many of my previous posts, the small new ECR labs will struggle to recruit students unless they sit within the auspices of a big, shiny person. If we choose to stay in academia after our PhDs, then we become postdocs. I could not find total postdocs for the UK, so I went local and had some lovely admin guys dig out the numbers. I defined postdocs as being grades 7 to 9 in the UK. In the early 2000s, there were around 800 of these researchers at Oxford. In the mid-2000s, there were more than double that, around 1,900. And closer to now, we've stayed roughly stable, dropping off by about 500 people. I suspect the late drop is a combination, again, of pandemic, Brexit, and the great academic abandonment. But either way, we've got over twice as many people as we had to support 20 years ago. Those postdocs were paid roughly in line with inflation, it turns out. So in 2000, the average starting salary was about $22,000. In 2010, it was $27,000. And in 2020, it was about $32,000. It should be noted that this salary is still relatively low. Starting salaries currently in the USA and Australia are around $10,000 more annually. So if you're thinking about your first postdoc, emigrate now whilst you still can. So we've established that there are 3 times as many people, 2 times as many postdocs, and that they all cost almost double what they did 20 years ago. But are people asking for more money? For this, I trawled through the UKRI funding database, as well as asking a local PI who's been gathering grants since the mid-90s. The UKRI database was enlightening but a little short. As I did with the postdocs, I made it local and just looked at grants awarded to Oxford because otherwise the spreadsheet was huge. About 8 or so years ago, the median funding requested was about $450,000. About a year ago, the median funding requested was about $450,000. The average is slightly higher recently, but it's been pulled by a couple of really big grants and a couple of oddly small ones. My local PI had an interesting list of research funding where he had 3-year project grants from almost 20 years ago at the same cost as 3-year project grants from 2019, both about $200,000. He stressed they were potentially not to do the same sort of work, but also agreed that the money didn't seem to go as far. So in terms of what we're doing with it, is it any different? Let's start with the basics and think about the sort of science we do now compared to the sort of science we did 20 years ago. Because of the drive to publish more and better and shinier papers, there is a consequent drive for more and better and shinier technologies. Over the last 20 years, the two that could be considered to have had the most impact on the cost of research are the use of transgenic animals and the use of omics techniques. The use of transgenic animals can run into the tens of thousands a month, and the running of single-cell sequencing, for example, can also be many thousands. So if I want to employ a postdoc who is going to expand a new colony of mice and single-cell sequence a few bits of their brain for 3 years, I have already run my budget to probably somewhere close to $500,000 to essentially do one large experiment. I am going to risk my neck and question whether that's a good use of funds. But let's assume you've got a grant for you and a postdoc to exist for 3 years. There's also the increasing and exceedingly variable cost of overheads to deal with. These are variable by institution and are applied to grants to do things like pay your finance officers and keep your lights on. The technical term for this is QR funding, and it can come from charities, industries, or from funding bodies. A large institution in the UK, like one of the London universities, can easily go through 140 million of this in a year. Is it any wonder they can't afford to keep you on permanently? But in real terms, QR funding is also falling, with Stephanie Smith, a Russell Group analyst, showing the numbers are down around 13% over the last 10 years. And all of this, the cost of things and people and space, is not even beginning to take into account the soft bits of science, the cost of publishing and the cost of conferences and the cost of training courses. If you want to publish a single gold open access Nature paper, you'll lose up to £9,000 in publishing charges, potentially almost 5% of your total science budget if you're on a £200,000 grant. It can cost up to that much to send a couple of postdocs to a European conference with registration fees and travel and accommodation. If somehow your 2 postdocs manage to make a Nature paper, they need big teams now, so it's unlikely. and wanted to take it to a conference, that's 10% of your budget suddenly gone. But on the upside, you have one of those coveted Nature papers, right? The upshot of all of this is that you, your students, and your science all cost more than they used to, but there hasn't really been a significant increase in the amount we're asking for. This means that instead of working in institutions making new, exciting discoveries, we're instead running the equivalent of the academic potato peel pie society and trying to stretch our leftovers into experiments, which is not something our forebears had to do 20 or even 10 years ago. And going forward, I'm not sure how long that attitude is sustainable and how competitive that will keep UK science and industry.
Thank you for listening. Join the Dementia Research bloggers and share your own views.